Keanu Reeves was hurrying through a crowded subway when a single voice cut through the noise, so haunting, so raw, it froze him mid-step. A homeless mother singing like a forgotten angel. In that moment, Keanu sensed her life was hanging by a thread, but he had no idea her voice would soon shock the entire nation. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The subway station beneath Los Angeles trembled with impatience as the stalled train hissed to a stop, its metal doors refusing to close while a muffled announcement crackled overhead. Commuters groaned in unison. Some checked their watches, others cursed under their breath, and a few darted toward the platform as if running would somehow make the train move again. Keanu Reeves stepped out with everyone else, though unlike the irritated crowd, he didn't show a hint of frustration. He simply slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and stood quietly near a pillar, waiting for the moment to pass. His day had already been tightly scheduled, yet he carried no urgency in his expression. The underground air was thick with that familiar metallic scent, carrying the faint vibration of trains moving somewhere far down the tunnel. Above him, harsh fluorescent lights flickered in a stubborn, uneven rhythm, casting pale shadows across the concrete floor. Keanu scanned the station out of habit, not for danger, but for peace. It was something he always did when surrounded by chaos. His eyes moved over rushed steps, tired faces, stressed shoulders, and hands gripping phones as if time itself was slipping away. Everyone seemed desperate to be somewhere else. Keanu instead stood still, almost blending into the cold subway architecture, like a quiet observer of everything happening around him. He exhaled slowly, trying to center himself before heading to the charity event he was already late for. The longer the delay stretched, the more restless the platform became. People began pacing in tight circles. A woman muttered angrily about losing her morning meeting. A teenager slammed his backpack onto a bench. Even a man in a business suit tried to force the train door open before giving up in frustration. Keanu shifted his stance slightly to give them space, maintaining a calm posture that contrasted sharply with the rising tension of the station. The conductor gave another update that sounded no different from the first, leaving everyone in the same suspended moment. Then, as the noise of complaints swelled, something soft floated beneath the chaos. At first, Keanu thought he imagined it a trick of the echoing station. But the sound grew stronger, weaving into the stale air with surprising clarity. It wasn't a shouted argument, a loud ringtone, or the rumble of another train. It was a voice so gentle, yet so piercing that Keanu's head turned before he even fully understood why. The melody carried a strange warmth. It rose slowly, almost trembling, then steadied itself with a depth that traveled across the platform like a quiet gust of wind. Keanu straightened, listening harder. The tone was fragile but full, and every note carried something raw. Pain, memory, emotion that had been held in for too long. He felt the hairs on his arms rise as the vibration of the voice reached him. People walked past without noticing, absorbed in their frustrations, yet Keanu remained still, caught by the invisible pull of that sound. His eyes searched the platform until he traced the voice back to a dim corner near a graffiti-covered column. There, on a torn piece of cardboard, sat a woman with her knees pulled close and her baby bundled under a thin gray blanket. Her clothes hung loosely worn from too many cold nights. Her hair fell unevenly across her face, strands sticking to her cheeks as she leaned forward. Yet the way she sang didn't match her appearance. Her voice didn't belong to someone society overlooked. It belonged to someone who carried a lifetime of unspoken stories inside her. The moment Keanu realized she was singing "Someone Like You," his breath caught. The notes poured out of her with a heartbreaking honesty that didn't try to impress anyone. She was singing like someone who had lost everything and was holding on to the last part of herself that hadn't been taken. Keanu remained rooted in place, unable to ignore how her voice transformed the entire atmosphere of the station. The fluorescent lights still flickered. The announcement system still crackled. Footsteps still echoed sharply across the concrete floor. Yet somehow, all of it faded into the background as her voice took center stage. She sang with a trembling strength, the kind that comes from someone who had endured more than she could articulate. Each lyric felt like a confession. Each breath carried years of surviving one painful moment after another. Her vibrato wavered slightly as if her heart was lodged in her throat, but the imperfections only made her voice more human, more haunting, more impossible for Keanu to turn away from. Commuters continued walking past her, with their heads down, each focused on their own deadlines and frustrations. A few tossed spare coins into the small paper cup beside her without looking. Others stepped around her as if she were part of the station structure rather than a living person pouring her soul into the air. No one paused, not even for a second. She was invisible to them, but to Keanu, she felt impossibly present. Her voice made the station feel less like a cold transit hub and more like a forgotten concert hall where beauty flickered in places no one expected it to survive. As she moved into the chorus, Keanu's throat tightened unexpectedly. It wasn't just the beauty of her voice, it was the pain behind it, the kind of pain that doesn't disguise itself. She sang like someone who had lost someone she loved deeply, someone who had fought to stay standing, someone who held her baby close at night, not because she was strong, but because she had no other choice. Her voice cracked faintly on a high note, and though most people would have judged it as a flaw, Keanu heard the truth in it. It was the sound of a heart breaking and rebuilding at the same time. He took a small step forward without realizing it. His eyes stayed locked on her, studying the rise and fall of her chest, the smallest tremble in her fingers, the way she tilted her head back, as if aiming the song upward, hoping anyone might hear her beyond these underground walls. The baby beside her shifted under the thin blanket, but did not wake. She adjusted the blanket between verses with the tenderness of a mother fighting exhaustion, then continued singing with renewed force. Keanu's pulse slowed as he listened, not with admiration, but with a strange, unexpected ache. He recognized something familiar in her, a quiet grief, a strength shaped by loss, a resilience built in silence, and it struck him that this voice, this moment, should not be happening under flickering bulbs and peeling paint. She should have been on a stage under warm lights, surrounded by people who understood the privilege of hearing her. The final stretch of the chorus rose like a plea. Her voice filled every corner of the station, echoing against the tile walls with surprising power. Even the angriest commuters softened slightly without knowing why. A few slowed their pace. One woman turned her head briefly before rushing on, but only Keanu remained completely still, breathing in the raw emotion pouring from someone the world had decided not to see. He felt something shift inside him, a small but unmistakable pull. It was the sense that he wasn't here by accident, that this delay, this crowded station, this exact moment had led him toward something important, something fragile, something he wasn't meant to walk away from. The last note of her song drifted upward and dissolved into the hollow echo of the station, leaving behind a silence so sharp it felt like the world had briefly forgotten how to breathe. She lowered her head slowly, almost apologetically, as if expecting nothing more than the usual indifference. But Keanu didn't move. His feet stayed planted, his eyes fixed on her. His breath caught somewhere between admiration and disbelief. In that stillness, he realized the lump in his throat hadn't formed from sadness alone. It came from recognition. Her voice carried a story, a lifetime of bruised hope and a courage worn thin, but not broken. A train screeched in the distance. Commuters shuffled past again, unaware they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Keanu took a single step forward, compelled by something deeper than impulse. He whispered to himself, almost in awe, wondering how someone so invisible could possess a voice so powerful. As she brushed a stray tear from her cheek and adjusted her baby's blanket, he felt certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't just a voice in a subway. It was a life waiting to be lifted. And as he stared at her, one question rose inside him, quiet and absolute. Who are you? Hours before the subway moment that would change everything, Keanu Reeves woke in the soft, pre-dawn light of his modest Los Angeles home. His schedule for the day was clear in his mind. He was expected at a charity event for underprivileged youth where he would speak about resilience and the strength that often hides in people who feel overlooked. It was a topic close to his heart, something he had lived through and witnessed in others. He rose quietly, made his bed, and walked to the kitchen where he brewed a simple cup of black coffee. The aroma filled the room with familiar comfort. He sipped slowly while gazing through the kitchen window, grounding himself before a long day. He ironed his shirt by hand, smoothing each crease with calm intention. There was no assistant helping him, no stylist preparing his wardrobe. He preferred doing it himself. It reminded him to stay humble, to stay connected to a simple life, even when fame pressed in from all sides. He dressed neatly but casually, choosing comfortable shoes and a jacket that wouldn't draw attention. He clipped his keys to his belt loop, took a final sip of his coffee, and stepped outside into the quiet morning air. Most celebrities would have arranged private transportation or a security escort for an event like this. Keanu thought differently. He enjoyed the freedom of moving like an ordinary person, blending into the rhythm of the city. The traffic reports that morning warned of major delays on the freeway, so he chose the subway without hesitation. It was faster, quieter, and gave him a sense of anonymity that he cherished. He walked to the station with his hands in his pockets, taking in the sounds of the city as it woke up. Street vendors set up their carts. Early commuters rushed by with steaming cups of coffee. A delivery truck rumbled down the road. The city was alive in a way that made him feel small and grounded, two things he valued deeply. When he descended the subway stairs, he blended instantly into the crowd. No cameras, no flashes, just people. Ordinary people with places to be, frustrations on their shoulders, and stories he would never know. He bought a ticket, passed through the turnstile, and stepped onto the platform where clusters of commuters waited impatiently. A child cried loudly near his mother's leg. Two teenagers argued about who lost the headphones. A man listened to music so loud the beat vibrated through the air. A woman in a suit rehearsed a speech under her breath. Keanu watched them all with quiet amusement, reminded of how human and universal these small moments were. When the train arrived, everyone pushed inward at once. Keanu followed, letting others go ahead of him. Inside, the car was tightly packed. Shoulders brushed, elbows bumped, and the air smelled faintly of cologne fabric and warm metal. Someone recognized him but didn't react loudly. They only smiled, and Keanu offered a small nod in return. He preferred it that way. A few people whispered his name under their breath, but most were too absorbed in their morning routine to care. The train lurched forward, and Keanu held a pole to steady himself. Despite the noise and the closeness of strangers, he felt strangely relaxed. He liked moments like this when he could disappear into a crowd without expectation or performance. But he had no idea this simple decision, this ordinary commute, would lead him straight into the most unexpected discovery of his entire day. The train sped through the first few stations without incident, rocking gently as it moved along the rails. Passengers shifted their weight, scrolled through their phones, or stared blankly at advertisements. A businessman near Keanu argued loudly through a headset, insisting that a missed deadline wasn't his fault. A teenager tried to balance a backpack, breakfast sandwich, and homework folder all at once. A young couple whispered to each other about weekend plans. Every corner of the car was filled with the ordinary sounds of everyday life. Keanu stood among them, feeling the quiet comfort of being just another person sharing the same morning struggle. As the train approached the next station, it began to slow more abruptly than usual. The lights flickered, and a low mechanical hum pulsed under the floor. People looked around with annoyed expressions. The train came to a jarring stop before fully reaching the platform. For a moment, everything was still. Then the speakers crackled to life with a garbled announcement. The conductor's voice echoed through the car, explaining that a temporary power delay would keep them halted for several minutes. A collective groan spread through the passengers. Keanu remained calm. He exhaled softly and shifted his feet to keep his balance as frustration bubbled around him. A woman sighed dramatically. Someone slapped the metal pole in irritation. The businessman began complaining even louder, blaming the transit system for ruining his entire morning. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking why the train wasn't moving. The car felt warmer as bodies pressed closer, and impatience thickened in the air. Keanu gave a few people space by stepping back near the doors, offering a gentle nod when someone muttered an apology for bumping into him. Several seconds passed before the doors hissed open with a reluctant squeal. The train hadn't reached the middle of the platform, but the conductor allowed passengers to step out if they preferred to wait outside. Many took the chance immediately. Some pushed through aggressively. Others mumbled complaints about being late. Keanu followed them out at a slower pace, stepping onto the platform and breathing in the slightly cooler air of the open station. He preferred staying squeezed in the crowded car. The platform wasn't much quieter. People paced back and forth. Some leaned against the tiled walls, tapping their feet. Others complained to no one in particular, venting their frustration into the echoing space. A teenager kicked a discarded soda can across the floor. A woman dropped her bag and scrambled to pick up her scattered belongings, while people stepped around her without stopping. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sharp shadows across the concrete. Keanu stood near the edge of the platform where he could stretch his legs without blocking anyone's path. He placed his hands in his pockets again, observing the ebb and flow of the crowd. Despite the noise, he found a small sense of calm in the moment. Delays happened. Plans shifted. Life rarely moved according to schedule. He took a deep breath, accepting the inconvenience, the way he accepted most things quietly and without irritation. He looked down the tracks, seeing only darkness and the faint glimmer of rails curving into the tunnel. Somewhere beyond that tunnel, he imagined another train approaching, or workers fixing the glitch that kept them trapped. But for now, he was simply another commuter waiting for the morning to straighten itself out. What he didn't know was that the delay, the frustration, the halted train, and his choice to step onto the platform were aligning toward a single moment waiting on the other side of the crowd. A moment he couldn't predict. A voice he didn't know existed yet. A life he was about to collide with in a way that would change both of them forever. Keanu stepped farther from the crowd, giving himself room to breathe as the platform shifted with restless footsteps. The hum of stalled electricity vibrated faintly through the rails, blending with quiet murmurs and the distant rumble of another train somewhere far down the line. He rolled his shoulders, once loosening tension that wasn't his, absorbing the moment with quiet patience. Around him, people scrolled through phones, checked watches, and sighed into the air as if the delay were a personal offense. Keanu simply watched them, reminded of how fragile mornings could be for people carrying heavy responsibilities. He took a slow breath, letting the metallic scent of the underground settle around him. Nothing about this moment felt special. Nothing felt significant. It was an inconvenience at best, a forgettable pause in an ordinary morning. Yet as he stood there unaware and unassuming, a voice was preparing to rise from the far corner of the station. A voice that would stop him cold. Keanu leaned back against the cold concrete pillar, letting his eyes drift shut for a brief second as the impatient murmurs around him softened. The delay had stretched longer than expected, but he didn't mind. He welcomed the moment to breathe. The station buzzed faintly with the low hum of motionless trains and distant vibrations. Then, threading through that dull background noise, a single sound rose so gently it almost felt like it wasn't meant for anyone to hear. A soft melody carried by a voice that emerged like a fragile breeze slipping through cracks in the city. Keanu's eyes opened immediately. Not because the sound was loud, but because it wasn't ordinary. There was a depth in the opening note that made him lift his head in quiet surprise. It wasn't the typical street singing he occasionally overheard near busy intersections. It wasn't raw or careless. It was careful, technical, and filled with emotion so layered it seemed to fold into the air itself. He turned his head slowly, following the sound, as if instinct alone guided him. The crowd shifted, blocking his view at first, but as the melody grew, he traced it to the far side of the platform, where the light dimmed and the tiled wall carried faint graffiti. There, sitting on a scrap of cardboard, was a young woman. maybe in her late 20s. Her hair fell loose in uneven strands around her face. Her clothes were worn to the point of losing their original color. Her posture was tired, weighed down by days spent fighting battles no one else could see. Beside her in a small stroller slept her baby. The child was wrapped in a thin, gray blanket that barely seemed warm enough for the chilly underground air. She kept one hand lightly on the stroller handle, steadying it whenever someone walked too close, as though shielding her child had become second nature. The woman clutched a worn paper cup at her feet, the small scattering of coins, barely enough to fill the bottom. But while her circumstances were heartbreaking, her voice told a different story, a much deeper one. She sang with the kind of emotional clarity that only came from someone who had loved deeply and lost even more. The song was Someone Like You, but she didn't sing it the way it was recorded or the way most street singers performed it. She sang it like each lyric was pulled from her own memories, her own grief, her own fragile hope. Keanu stood straighter, his focus narrowing to her completely. He noticed the way her chest rose and fell with controlled breath, support the telltale sign of someone who once trained to use their voice properly. Her fingers tapped softly on her knee in perfect rhythm, keeping time even when her voice wavered under emotion. She wasn't performing for attention. She wasn't chasing applause. She was releasing something she carried inside, something too heavy to hold alone. Commuters walked past her without turning their heads. Some glanced at her briefly with polite indifference. Others didn't look at all, as if the corner she sat in was invisible. But Keanu felt an unmistakable pull toward her, as strong and quiet as gravity. Something in her voice reached into him, stirring a familiar ache he couldn't quite name. The deeper she moved into the song, the more the station seemed to shift around her. The harsh fluorescent lights still flickered, but they no longer felt cold. The mechanical hum of stalled trains continued beneath the floor, but it no longer sounded intrusive. Even the scattered footsteps of commuters seemed to soften beneath the weight of her voice. It was as if the entire environment had been rearranged to accommodate the fragile beauty rising from that dim corner. Her voice didn't demand attention. It invited it gently but irresistibly, like an open door leading into a forgotten memory. As she reached the second verse, her posture straightened just slightly. The change was small, but Keanu noticed. The strength in her breath lifted. Her tone rounded out, no longer trembling, but blooming with quiet confidence. It was the change that happened when someone stopped surviving through a song and began living inside of it. Keanu watched the shift with the same careful attention he gave to art, to pain, to people who carried invisible weight. He felt with growing certainty that this woman wasn't just talented. She had once been trained, guided, encouraged. Someone had believed in her before life had forced her to believe in survival instead. He studied her expression as she sang, seeing the way sorrow and hope moved across her face in alternating waves. Her eyes remained half closed, not to block out the world, but because she was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from the cold concrete beneath her, somewhere before the hardship etched lines around her mouth. Her voice carried both that memory and the reality she lived in now. It created a tension that was painful and breathtaking at the same time. She reached for a higher note, and it wavered, not from lack of talent, but from the emotional crack in her voice that revealed something deeply personal. Keanu felt that vibration strike him like a soft blow. He wasn't reacting as an actor or a public figure or a passerby. He was reacting as a human being who recognized hidden suffering. He recognized the silent resilience of someone who had loved fiercely, lost painfully, and kept going because there was no other choice. Her baby stirred in the stroller, shifting beneath the thin blanket. She didn't pause or flinch. Instead, she placed one gentle hand on the stroller to soothe the child, all while continuing to sing with the same emotional intensity. It was a gesture so natural, yet so heartbreaking, that Keanu's chest tightened. The world expected her to be two things at once: a mother fighting for survival and an artist whose voice could move hearts. Most people never gave her the dignity of acknowledging either. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing loudly as they exited the station. Their laughter bounced off the tiled walls, but the woman never broke her concentration. A businessman marched past her, annoyed by the delay, and tapping loudly on his phone screen. A couple argued quietly near the stairs about who forgot the keys. All of life moved around her without pause, yet she stayed anchored to her cardboard square, singing as if this small, forgotten corner was the only stage left where her soul was allowed to breathe. Keanu felt something awaken inside him. A protective instinct, quiet but undeniable, flickered to life. He knew what it meant to be overlooked. He knew what it felt like to carry grief that people couldn't see. And as he listened, he sensed that she wasn't simply singing for money. She was singing to stay alive. As the final verse rose from her lips, Keanu felt the world narrow to a single point. He was no longer aware of the station's noise or the restless crowd behind him. All he could hear was the tremble in her voice as she carried the song toward its emotional peak. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers tightening on the stroller handle, as though bracing herself against a wave of memories. Her voice dipped into a soft breath, then climbed again with a rawness that made Keanu draw in a slow, steady breath of his own. He watched her face closely. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when her expression shifted from practiced composure to exposed vulnerability. Her lips quivered between words, her brows drew together in a silent ache. Then she opened her eyes just for a second, revealing a depth so heavy it seemed to pull the air toward her. Keanu felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. This wasn't performance. This wasn't an attempt to be discovered. This was someone rediscovering the last part of herself she still trusted. A small gust of air blew through the platform as another train approached in the far tunnel, but she kept singing, her voice rising above the distant rumble. The contrast made the moment feel almost unreal. A forgotten artist pouring her heart into a song that deserved a grand hall. Yet here she was, surrounded by concrete cold air and strangers who didn't bother to stop. When she reached the climax of the chorus, her vibrato tightened, trembling with the weight of everything she had endured. The note wasn't perfect. It cracked ever so slightly, but that crack felt like the truth breaking through the surface. Keanu felt it hit him with surprising force. In that sound, he sensed years of buried dreams, lost love, shattered security, and the fierce determination to keep her baby warm, no matter how unforgiving the world became. As the last note stretched into silence, Keanu felt something inside him shift permanently. He wasn't listening to a street singer. He was witnessing someone fighting to be heard before life swallowed her whole, and he knew he couldn't walk away. When the last note faded into the hollow air of the station, the woman lowered her head slowly, almost shrinking into herself, as if bracing for disappointment. She didn't look up to see if anyone stopped. She didn't wait for applause or even acknowledgement. Her shoulders settled into a small curve of resignation. It was the familiar posture of someone who had learned not to expect anything from the world. She adjusted the thin blanket covering her baby, her movements tender yet weary, and reached for the paper cup at her feet, as though preparing to gather what few coins remained and move on. Keanu stepped forward without rushing, each movement quiet and deliberate. He didn't want to startle her. He didn't want to approach like someone who pitied her. He simply felt drawn to her with a sincerity that surprised even him. As he walked toward the dim corner where she sat, a few commuters glanced his way, but no one paid attention long enough to realize what was happening. The woman didn't notice him at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground as she tried to steady her breath, as if singing had taken something out of her she wasn't sure she had to give. When Keanu crouched down to her level, she finally looked up. Her body stiffened instantly. It was the reflex of someone used to being judged, dismissed, or filmed without consent. Her eyes darted slightly, as if preparing for ridicule or an unwanted comment. She pulled the stroller closer and pressed her hand on the handle protectively, a gesture that revealed how often she had to defend herself and her child from the world's harsher corners. Keanu spoke softly, keeping his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention from the passing crowd. He asked her whether she had ever taken singing lessons. Just that simple question. No fanfare, no grand opening. Her expression shifted from guarded tension to confusion. Then her brows lifted, slightly revealing disbelief. She blinked as if she wasn't sure she heard him correctly. Most people who approached her usually said the same things. Are you okay? Do you need money? Can you move out of the way? Can I film this for my social media? But none of them asked about her voice. None of them saw her as anything more than her situation. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips parted. When she finally spoke, her voice came out fragile, unsure. She said she used to dream of becoming a singer. She told him how she once joined her school choir, how her teachers praised her voice, how she even won small local competitions when she was younger. There was a flicker of pride in her tone, but it was shadowed by something heavier, years of disappointment, years of stepping away from the dreams she once believed in. Keanu listened intently, giving her his full attention, something she clearly wasn't used to. She continued slowly explaining how her life had unraveled after her husband died in a construction accident. She told him about the unexpected medical bills, the eviction notices, the frantic search for work, and the long nights rocking her baby to sleep in shelters. She admitted she sang in the subway not because she wanted to perform for strangers, but because she needed to buy milk. She said it quietly, without drama. It was simply the truth of her life. Keanu didn't interrupt. He didn't shift uncomfortably or offer quick reassurances. He let her speak in her own time, absorbing each word with the same sincerity he would offer to a close friend. Something softened in her expression as she realized he wasn't rushing her story. She lowered her gaze again, as if embarrassed for having spoken so much. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers trembling slightly, then whispered that people usually didn't care about her story. Most only listened long enough to decide whether she was worth a handful of spare coins. She admitted she had grown used to being invisible. At first, she had sung hoping someone might notice her talent, but the longer she stayed on the streets, the more she realized people didn't look for beauty in places they considered broken. She smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile someone gives when they've accepted something painful. Keanu stayed at her eye level, refusing to tower over her. His posture was relaxed, open, gentle. He asked her name, and she told him quietly. The sound of her own name seemed to surprise her, as if she hadn't spoken it to someone who cared in weeks. He nodded softly, repeating it with respect, then asked how long she had been singing in the station. She explained that she rotated between different spots in the city, depending on which station's security allowed her to stay longer before asking her to move. She joked weakly that she knew the acoustics of every tunnel in the city better than most performers knew their own stages. As she talked, her baby shifted in the stroller again. She looked down with gentle eyes and adjusted the blanket once more, tightening the corners so the baby wouldn't feel the cold. Keanu watched the tenderness in her movements. Even exhausted, even worn down by life, she cared for her child with steady devotion. That simple act deepened the ache in his chest. It made her voice make even more sense. Her strength, her vulnerability, her pain, all of it was wrapped carefully around the little life she protected. She glanced at him nervously, expecting the moment to end. People often grew uncomfortable once her story became heavy. They usually nodded politely, offered a few dollars, and walked away quickly. She braced herself for that familiar pattern, already preparing to say thank you before he pulled out his wallet. But Keanu didn't reach for money. Instead, he leaned in slightly and asked a question she clearly didn't expect. He asked whether she still wanted to pursue music. Her eyes widened, first in shock, then in disbelief. She let out a small, bitter laugh. It wasn't mocking him, it was directed at herself, at her situation, at the absurdity of dreaming when survival barely allowed her to breathe. She told him there was no point, that dreams were for people with support, with rest, with safety, with time. She said she didn't have any of those. She gestured to the stroller, then to the cardboard beneath her. She said music belonged to a different life, a life she lost the day she lost her husband. Her voice trembled and she looked away, unable to keep meeting his eyes. She expected him to let the moment pass, to offer sympathy, to tell her she had a beautiful voice, but that life was unfair. Instead, Keanu didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He didn't let her dismiss herself. He held her gaze steady and calm, and told her something she hadn't heard in a long time. He told her she had something rare, something real, something people needed to hear. She stared at him, stunned into silence. Her lips parted, but no words came out. It was as if the world had stopped long enough for her to absorb the possibility that someone finally saw her as more than her circumstances. Her breath caught as his words settled over her, fragile and unfamiliar, like warmth she hadn't felt in years. She blinked hard, trying to process the sincerity in his eyes. For a moment she seemed suspended between hope and disbelief, unsure which one would hurt less. Then the emotion overwhelmed her. Her shoulders trembled and she covered her mouth with one hand as tears filled her eyes, falling before she could stop them. She wasn't crying from sadness alone. She was crying because someone had finally seen her. Not the worn clothes, not the cardboard, not the exhaustion, but her. She whispered that no one had said anything kind about her voice in a long time. Not since before the accident, not since before her life collapsed. She said she didn't remember the last time someone looked at her without pity or discomfort. Keanu shook his head gently, telling her he didn't pity her. He admired her strength. He told her the world had been unfair, but her voice was proof she hadn't been defeated. She pressed her palm to her heart, as if steadying it. In that small corner of the subway, something shifted inside her. She wasn't invisible anymore, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe she might rise again. For a long moment, Keanu didn't speak. He let her breathe. He waited quietly as she wiped her tears with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the emotion that kept spilling out. She shook her head lightly, muttering an apology, as if crying were something she needed permission to do. Keanu reassured her softly that she had nothing to apologize for. He told her anyone who carried what she carried would struggle to hold it together. She pressed her trembling fingers against her lips, trying to steady herself. Her baby shifted again in the stroller, letting out a faint whimper, and she leaned down instinctively to soothe the child with slow, gentle strokes. Keanu watched her with a warmth that made her shoulders relax, even if only slightly. He didn't rush the moment or push her to talk. He simply remained beside her, crouched at her level, giving her space to recover. When she finally took a deep breath and lifted her head again, her eyes were red but clearer. She met his gaze with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty, still unsure what to do with the kindness he had shown. That was when Keanu decided the moment was right. He told her he had an idea. She tensed again, expecting him to offer money, and she straightened her spine as if preparing to refuse. But he didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he spoke calmly and told her about a small studio he sometimes used. He explained that it wasn't fancy, not some glamorous Hollywood setup, but a simple place used for charity projects, small recordings, and community programs. He said it was quiet, safe, and perfect for capturing a voice like hers. She blinked, confused. She asked why her voice mattered enough for something like that. Keanu smiled in a gentle, almost fatherly way, and told her that her voice deserved a home better than a subway corner. He said he wanted her to come by the next day just to record a simple demo. Nothing formal, nothing intimidating, nothing that cost her anything. Just her voice, and a chance. Her first reaction was panic. She shook her head sharply, insisting she couldn't accept charity. Her tone wasn't angry, it was defensive, fragile, frightened. She explained that people had offered help before only to twist it later into obligations she couldn't fulfill. She said she had learned the hard way that nothing came free, and she had no more emotional strength left to owe anyone anything. Keanu listened without looking offended. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth behind her fear. Then he told her quietly that this wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a favor. It was opportunity, a doorway, a small one, but real. He said her voice was too rare, too powerful, too full of life to be left unheard. He told her he wasn't giving her something. He was offering her the chance to reclaim something she had lost. She stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. Her baby stirred again as she hesitated, letting out a small cry. Keanu instinctively reached down and adjusted the thin blanket, around the child, tucking it securely so the cold wouldn't reach the baby's legs. The gesture was so gentle, so unforced, that something inside her softened instantly. She had seen many people look away from her child. Keanu cared enough to look closer. She watched him gently tuck the blanket around her baby, and for the first time since he approached her, she didn't pull back. The small act disarmed her in a way words never could. People rushed past her every day, annoyed by her presence or indifferent to her struggle, but no one ever paused long enough to notice the way the baby shivered or how thin the blanket really was. No one had ever cared enough to reach down and fix it. That one gesture made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't have a name for anymore. She whispered that she wasn't used to kindness without consequence. Keanu nodded as if he understood perfectly. He told her he wasn't here to take anything from her. He wasn't here to make her a project, a headline, or a story to tell later. He was simply someone who heard a voice that shouldn't be buried under concrete, a voice that deserved to stand somewhere warmer, somewhere brighter. She stared at him, unsure whether she believed in that kind of hope anymore. Dreams had cost her too much already. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for money, but for a small, simple business card. Nothing flashy, just a name, a phone number, and the address of the studio. He held it out to her with quiet confidence. She stared at it without touching it, her hand hovering uncertainly in the air. She asked him why. Why would he help her? Why would someone like him look twice at someone like her? She said it softly, almost ashamed to ask. Keanu didn't hesitate. He said everyone deserved a chance to rise again. He told her he had seen people lose everything and rebuild. He had witnessed lives change in moments just like this, moments when one person stepped in and reminded someone else that they still mattered. He said the world didn't always give second chances, but people could. Then, he added something that made her breath catch. He said sometimes all it took was one person willing to say the words she hadn't heard in far too long, "I believe in you." Her hand shook as she finally reached forward and took the card. She held it delicately, almost afraid it would disappear if she gripped it too tightly. Her fingers brushed the surface, as though touching a fragile promise. She whispered that she didn't know if she was brave enough to try again. Keanu smiled softly and told her that bravery didn't always roar. Sometimes it was just showing up. Sometimes it was walking through a door, even when fear followed close behind. She looked down at her baby sleeping peacefully beneath the newly arranged blanket. The child's tiny chest rose and fell in steady breaths. She swallowed hard, a wave of emotion rising in her. She admitted that she wanted more for her child than cardboard floors and uncertainty. She wanted her baby to grow up seeing her as someone who didn't give up, someone who fought, someone who tried. Keanu nodded as if he knew she had reached the turning point on her own. He didn't push. He didn't pressure. He simply waited in patient silence, letting her come to the decision in her own time. When she finally looked back up at him, her eyes held something different. Not confidence, not certainty, but a spark. A tiny glimmer of the woman she once was. She said she would come. When she finally whispered that she would come, the words seemed to lift something heavy from her shoulders. It wasn't a loud declaration or a confident promise. It was fragile trembling, but real. Keanu nodded with quiet approval, as if he had known all along that she had the strength to say yes. He didn't congratulate her or make the moment dramatic. He simply let her breathe, letting the decision settle gently between them. She looked down at the card in her hand, tracing the printed letters with her thumb. The studio address seemed almost unreal, like an invitation to a world she had once belonged to, but never thought she would enter again. She held the card close to her chest for a moment, before slipping it into her worn bag, handling it the way someone handles the first hopeful thing they've been given in years. Her baby made a small sound, stretching under the blanket. Keanu glanced at the stroller again and noticed how little she had with her. Without saying anything, he reached into one of the side pockets of the stroller and slipped a folded envelope inside, hidden enough that she wouldn't see it until later. He didn't want her to feel watched or obligated. He wanted her and her baby to have food, warmth, and breathing space for the coming days. When he stood, She instinctively rose with him, still unsure whether the moment was truly happening. She asked once more why he would help a stranger. The question carried no bitterness now, only fear, gratitude, and disbelief bound together in her trembling voice. Keanu looked at her with deep sincerity and told her that she wasn't a stranger. Not anymore. He said that sometimes life crossed paths for reasons people couldn't explain, and sometimes the world gave second chances through the hands of ordinary moments. She bowed her head, overwhelmed, unable to find the words to respond. By the time she looked up again, Keanu had already turned to leave, blending into the moving crowd as quietly as he had appeared. She glanced down at the stroller and noticed the envelope. When she opened it and saw enough money to keep her child fed for days, her breath broke into soft sobs. It was the first time in years that kindness arrived without conditions, and it marked the moment her life began to shift toward something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The next morning came faster than she expected. She barely slept the night before, lying awake in the small shelter room she shared with two other mothers and their children. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Keanu's face, heard his voice, repeating the words she had almost forgotten how to believe in. She kept touching the business card, tucked safely inside her bag, as if confirming it hadn't disappeared overnight. Her baby slept curled against her chest, warm and peaceful, under the borrowed blankets, unaware that his mother was trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. Before dawn, she rose quietly, careful not to wake her neighbors. She washed her clothes in the shelter sink, scrubbing them gently and pressing them dry with an old towel. They were still worn, still faded, but clean. She tied her hair back neatly and wiped her shoes with a damp cloth until the dirt faded from the cracks. She didn't want to arrive looking like someone who didn't belong. She wanted to show effort, even if it was all she had. She packed her baby's blanket, a bottle, and the last of the formula she had left, grateful that the envelope Keanu had left had bought enough food for the morning. She made her way to the studio by bus, holding her baby close as the city moved around her. Every stop felt like a test of courage. Every passing minute challenged the small voice inside her, insisting she was making a mistake. She kept imagining the worst scenarios: Keanu forgetting the studio being closed, the sound engineer laughing at her. By the time she reached the address, her stomach fluttered with nerves strong enough to make her hand shake. The building was small but welcoming, tucked between a bakery and a repair shop. She stood in front of the glass door for a long moment, adjusting her grip on the stroller handle, reminding herself that she had promised her child she wouldn't give up. Then she exhaled deeply and pushed the door open. Keanu greeted her immediately. He didn't make her wait. He didn't hide behind assistants or schedules. He stood at the entrance in a simple black shirt, holding 2 bottled waters and a small paper bag. When he saw her hesitation, he smiled in a way that eased the tightness in her chest. He offered her the water and placed the bag on the stroller tray. Inside were small snacks, baby food, and a few items she hadn't even thought to pack. He told her softly that she was exactly where she needed to be. The words warmed her more than the morning sun. She stepped inside, taking in the space slowly. The studio was modest but clean, with acoustic foam arranged along the walls, a few microphones, a sound booth with fogged glass, and a small computer setup where the tracks would be recorded. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt safe. Safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. Keanu introduced her to the sound engineer, a quiet man with gentle eyes who greeted her with a respectful nod. He didn't stare at her clothes or her stroller or the circles under her eyes. He only said he had heard about her voice and was excited to listen in person. She blushed, unsure whether to believe him. But the sincerity in his expression made her relax just a little. Keanu guided her toward the recording booth. Her legs felt weak, but she followed, holding her breath as though stepping onto sacred ground. Inside the recording booth, she hesitated near the microphone, unsure where to stand or how close to be. The space felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. She traced her fingers lightly over the padded walls, as if confirming she wasn't dreaming. Her baby slept quietly just outside the booth, the stroller parked close enough for her to see through the soundproof glass. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the stroller, making sure her child was still comfortable. Keanu noticed and assured her that he would stay beside the stroller the entire time. That small promise eased the worry in her eyes. The sound engineer adjusted a few settings, speaking gently as he explained how the microphone worked, how the headphones sat over her ears, and how she could take as many breaks as she needed. She nodded along, though her hands trembled when she reached for the headphones. She admitted quietly that she had never recorded anything in a studio before, not even once. The engineer smiled and told her that some of the greatest voices he had ever heard came from people who started exactly where she was standing now. Keanu stepped behind the glass, giving her space while still letting her know he was there. His presence alone steadied her. He clasped his hands calmly in front of him, offering a reassuring nod through the booth window. She took one long, shaky breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and tried to silence the doubt swirling inside her. She worried that her voice wouldn't be good enough, that nerves would choke her throat, that the engineer would regret agreeing to record her. But beneath all those fears was a small flame of determination she couldn't ignore. She had come this far. She owed it to her child, and maybe to herself, to try. When the engineer asked what she wanted to sing, she hesitated. There were hundreds of songs she loved, but only one felt honest enough to define her life. She chose Someone Like You, not because she had sung it the day before, but because the song held pieces of her story: loss, love, and the hope that something gently beautiful could still rise from brokenness. The engineer nodded and pressed the button to begin recording. The booth filled with quiet static as the track began. She lifted the headphones, placed them over her ears, and let the first soft notes settle around her. Her throat tightened with nerves, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. She reminded herself she wasn't singing for applause or judgment. She was singing because it was the only thing that had ever made her feel whole. When she opened her mouth, the first note came out trembling barely more than a breath. But as she found her footing, her voice grew steadier, stronger, fuller. Her tone wrapped around the melody with the same emotional honesty she had shown in the subway, but here in the quiet of the studio, it felt even more intimate. There were no passing footsteps, no cold air, no indifference, only her voice clear and unfiltered. Keanu felt the same chill run up his arms that he had felt the day before. The sound engineer, mid-adjustment, paused with his fingers hovering over the controls, eyes widening with surprise. Neither man spoke. They didn't dare interrupt the moment forming in front of them. Her voice soared through the room, filling it with something too real and too fragile to describe. As she reached the final chorus, her voice tightened with emotion she had tried to bury for too long. Her breath shook, her lower lip trembled, but she didn't stop. She carried the song through its last fragile notes, her voice thinning slightly as the memories attached to every lyric pressed against her heart. When the last line faded, she lowered her head, her shoulders lifting and falling with uneven breaths. She whispered an apology, convinced she had ruined the recording somehow. Keanu stepped into the booth the moment the engineer signaled that the track had finished. He shook his head firmly before she could speak again and told her she hadn't made a single mistake. He said the truth in her voice was the most powerful thing he had heard in years. The sound engineer joined them at the booth entrance, nodding with genuine awe. He told her her voice carried something people paid thousands of dollars trying to imitate. She pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold herself together. When the engineer played the recording back, she heard her voice in high-quality audio for the very first time. It didn't sound like the tired woman she saw in Reflections. It didn't sound like someone the world had forgotten. It sounded like a singer, a real one, someone with depth, with clarity, with a story that reached through every note. Her hand flew to her mouth and tears pooled in her eyes before she could blink them away. She had never heard herself sound like this. She had never believed she could. Her entire body shook with disbelief as the track continued. When the final note played, she broke down completely, crying softly into her palms, while her baby slept peacefully outside the booth. For the first time in years, she felt like she had found the part of herself she thought was gone forever. After the recording session ended, She stepped out of the booth with her cheeks still wet from the tears she couldn't control. Her legs felt weak from the emotional release, and her hands shook as she held the small demo copy the engineer had handed her. Keanu guided her gently toward the lounge area, a quiet space with 2 couches, a small table, and a shelf filled with old music magazines. She sat slowly still, clutching the headphones around her neck as if afraid the song might escape. Keanu poured her a cup of water and placed it on the table beside her, then sat across from her with the same calm presence he had carried from the subway to the studio. For a few minutes she didn't speak. She simply breathed, her chest rising and falling as she tried to absorb what had just happened. When she finally lifted her eyes to Keanu, the gratitude there was almost too raw to voice. She whispered that she hadn't heard her own voice like that since she was a teenager. She said it felt like hearing someone she used to know, someone she thought had disappeared forever. Keanu smiled softly and told her that part of her had never disappeared. It had only been waiting for the right moment to come back. He asked her about her dreams, the ones she once had before survival became the only thing she could think about. She hesitated, then admitted she used to imagine singing professionally, even if only for small crowds. She dreamed of standing on real stages instead of cold subway floors. She dreamed of giving her child a life where music wasn't drowned out by hardship. But she said every dream felt distant now, buried under bills, shelters, and days that stretched endlessly into uncertainty. She said she wished she could give her baby stability, safety, dignity, anything that made tomorrow feel less frightening. Keanu listened without interrupting, nodding with quiet understanding. His gaze stayed steady on her, grounding her as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned forward slightly and asked her permission for something. His tone was gentle, almost cautious, as if he knew the question might overwhelm her. She blinked uncertain and asked what he meant. He said he wanted to send the demo recording to someone he trusted. For a second, she didn't understand. She asked who he meant, a little confused. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he waited until he had her full attention, then told her the truth. He wanted to send her demo to the casting team at America's Got Talent. She froze. Her fingers tightened around the cup until the plastic creaked. She shook her head quickly, panic rising fast. She told him she wasn't good enough. She told him shows like that were for people with training, with resources, with real experience. She said she would embarrass herself. She said she couldn't stand the thought of being rejected on national television. Her voice cracked as she spoke, revealing how deeply she feared being seen, only to be dismissed again. Keanu raised a hand, gently stopping her spiral. He reassured her that nothing bad would happen. The worst outcome, he said, was that they might ask her to try again next year. No humiliation, no cruelty, just an opportunity. And if they loved her voice, everything could change. She tried to steady her breathing, but the idea alone made her chest tighten. She looked down at the demo copy in her lap, her fingers brushing the edge of the disc as if afraid it might burn her. She whispered that people like her didn't end up on television. She said she wasn't special. She said no one would want to hear her story. She sounded as though she was trying to shield herself from disappointment by rejecting the possibility before it could reject her. Keanu leaned back slightly, giving her space, but not giving up. He told her she didn't need to think about judges or cameras or stages. All she needed to think about was her voice, her truth, her courage. She wiped her cheek with her sleeve, her eyes filling again with tears she tried to hide. She whispered that she didn't understand why he cared so much, why he was doing this, why he believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself long ago. Keanu took a long breath before answering. He told her he didn't have a complicated explanation. He simply didn't believe that her voice was meant to stay buried in underground tunnels. He said the world needed voices like hers, voices that carried pain and hope in the same breath. He told her that sometimes strangers saw things in us we couldn't see ourselves, and that didn't make it any less true. She stared at him, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his tone. Her baby stirred again, letting out a soft cry, and she reached down to comfort him. As she did, Keanu stood and walked toward the small desk where the engineer had transferred the file. He picked up the USB drive, holding her recording, turning it gently in his fingers, as though holding something precious. He asked her again, politely, respectfully, if he had her permission to send it. Her throat tightened. She didn't answer at first. She looked at her baby, then at the demo, then at Keanu. Fear fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. But beneath the fear was something else, a spark she couldn't completely ignore. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Keanu smiled softly, relieved but not triumphant. He crossed the room to the small computer near the mixing board, placed the USB drive into the port, and opened a blank email. She watched from the couch, her heartbeat unsteady, her palms damp with nerves. He typed carefully, not rushing a single word. When he finished, she asked what he wrote. Keanu turned the screen so she could see. The message was short. Please listen carefully. The sender prefers anonymity. There was no mention of his name, no hint that he was involved, no influence, no celebrity advantage, just her voice standing on its own. She stared at the screen in disbelief and whispered that he didn't have to hide who he was. Keanu shook his head gently and told her that he wanted her talent, not his reputation, to speak first. He clicked send. Her breath stopped in her throat as the email disappeared from the screen. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel possible. But it was done. Her voice was out there, heard, recorded, submitted. She covered her face with both hands, her shoulders shaking again as emotion washed through her. Keanu moved closer, offering her a quiet presence instead of words. She needed space to feel everything hitting her at once. For the first time in years, the future felt like a door instead of a wall. When she finally lowered her hands from her face, her eyes were red, but the expression behind them was different from earlier. There was fear, yes, but also a cautious glow of possibility. She held the demo copy against her chest as though it were something living, something fragile that she needed to protect. Keanu noticed and offered her a small bag sitting on the counter. Inside were groceries, formula snacks, and a few essentials she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. She tried to protest, saying he had already done enough, but he shook his head gently. He told her these weren't gifts. They were tools to help her breathe easier while she waited. He walked her to the door, holding it open as she pushed the stroller outside. The sunlight hit her face, and she blinked at the brightness. She looked back at him once more, unsure whether to thank him or apologize again for crying. Keanu smiled softly and told her she didn't need to say anything. He only reminded her to call him if she needed help or had questions. It wasn't an obligation. It was an invitation. She nodded slowly and whispered that she wasn't sure what would happen next. Keanu answered that none of them knew, but that uncertainty didn't make the moment any less real. He told her that whatever came from the demo, she had already done something brave by allowing herself to be heard. She pressed her hand to her heart, overwhelmed again by the quiet truth of his words. As she walked away, pushing the stroller down the sidewalk, she clutched the demo copy tightly. It wasn't just a recording. It was a lifeline, a piece of her past rediscovered, a piece of her future waiting. She didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to follow it. The first week passed slowly, stretching across long days in the subway station where the air always smelled faintly of metal and dust. She returned to her usual corner every morning, settling the stroller beside her, arranging the thin blanket, and warming her baby's hands between her palms before she began to sing. Her voice remained steady, but her heart wavered. She kept glancing at her phone, though she hadn't received calls in months. Every vibration she imagined, every sound she thought might be a notification, sent her pulse racing, only to fall flat again. She reminded herself that thousands of hopeful singers submitted demos every year. She reminded herself she was just one voice among many. She tried not to think about the email Keanu had sent, or the way he had looked at her with quiet confidence, certain that something good would come from it. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust the warmth he carried so naturally. But as the second week inched forward, doubt sunk deeper into her chest. She wondered if she had misunderstood him. Maybe he had said those things only to be kind. Maybe her voice wasn't as rare as he believed. Some days she sang with strength. Other days she sang through tears. Commuters passed her as usual, dropping coins into her cup without looking at her. Familiar faces appeared and disappeared. A young woman in scrubs who always hurried past after long shifts. A man who read the same newspaper every morning but never looked up. A teenager who bobbed his head to her singing but never stopped to listen. Life in the station didn't change, even though her world felt like it was perched on the edge of something she couldn't name. When the third week began, her hope thinned like the last pages of a worn book. She found herself waking in the middle of the night at the shelter, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had let herself dream too soon. She feared that she had imagined the possibility of change because she was tired of darkness. She whispered to her baby that she was sorry for believing in something she couldn't guarantee. The child would wrap tiny fingers around hers, unaware of the battle waging inside his mother. But when her doubts grew, the loudest memories of Keanu quieted them. She remembered the sincerity in his voice, the stillness in his eyes when he listened to her speak, the gentle way he adjusted her baby's blanket. He never once spoke like a man offering pity. He never acted as if she were a burden. He carried himself with humility, grounding her even when she felt like she was unraveling. Late at night, when the station was nearly empty, Keanu sometimes returned with bags of food, warm blankets, or small toys for her baby. He never stayed long. He never announced his arrival. He would place the items beside her stroller with a soft smile, asking if she was managing, then disappear into the shadows before anyone recognized him. She tried to thank him each time, but he brushed her gratitude away, telling her the world became softer when people looked out for each other. These moments kept her steady when the silence from the audition team made her feel invisible again. As the days continued, the silence from America's Got Talent felt heavier than the concrete walls around her. She tried to convince herself it was normal, that auditions took time, that thousands of demos were probably waiting to be heard. But each morning she returned to the subway. Her hope dimmed slightly. Her voice still rose through the tunnels, soft and steady, but she felt the difference inside. Her singing no longer came from expectation. It came from survival. Some evenings, when the wind seeped through the cracks of the station, she wrapped her baby tighter and wondered what she would do if nothing changed. The envelope Keanu had left helped more than she could express, but money disappeared quickly when every day demanded something new. Formula, diapers, bus fare. A cheap meal she divided carefully between herself and her child. She whispered into her baby's hair that she would keep fighting even if life refused to lift her out of the struggle. But sometimes, when the station grew quiet, she allowed herself a moment of doubt, asking whether dreams were meant for people like her. Yet, Keanu never let her drift too far into despair. Some nights, he appeared at the far end of the platform, hands in his pockets, head slightly lowered, as if he hoped not to draw attention. He always carried something helpful, but never overwhelming: a box of wipes, a warm blanket, fresh fruit, a soft rattle for the baby. He placed the items beside her with the same gentle respect he had shown from the beginning. He never spoke loudly, never lectured, never acted like a savior. He simply asked how she was managing and listened to her answer with genuine care. She found comfort in those brief interactions. His presence reminded her she wasn't alone in the dark. She began to look forward to the nights he appeared, though she never expected him to come. Sometimes they spoke for a minute. Sometimes they shared silent understanding. He once told her he admired her for showing up every day, even when life refused to bend. She carried those words with her like a shield. By the end of the third week, she felt suspended between two worlds, the life she knew and the faint outline of one she barely dared to imagine. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but something small inside refused to die. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Keanu's quiet belief. And even when her own faith wavered, his steadiness kept a fragile thread of hope alive. She didn't know that everything was about to change. She didn't know an email had just been sent to Keanu's phone. She didn't know her voice had reached someone who couldn't ignore it. But she would know soon, very soon. The afternoon began like any other. She sat on a worn subway bench with her baby in her lap, gently feeding him small spoonfuls of oatmeal she had mixed with warm water from a cafe. The platform hummed with its usual rhythm. footsteps echoing through the tunnels, trains rolling in with mechanical sighs, voices rising and fading like passing waves. She had long grown used to the noise, the motion, the constant reminder that the world moved whether she kept up or not. Today felt no different, just another day of waiting for something she wasn't sure would ever come. Her baby playfully grabbed at the spoon, smearing oatmeal across her sleeve. She laughed softly, wiping his face with a napkin. It was one of the few moments she allowed herself pure joy untainted by fear or uncertainty. When he smiled, she felt the strength to keep going even when life pressed against her ribs. As she reached for his bottle, her phone buzzed inside her pocket. The vibration startled her. She didn't receive calls, not from friends, not from family, not from anyone. Her number existed only as a formality, a requirement for shelters and paperwork. Unknown numbers usually meant spam or wrong dials. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but something, maybe the quiet echo of hope she had tried so hard to silence, nudged her to answer. She pressed the phone to her ear cautiously. Her voice wavered slightly as she said hello. A calm voice introduced themselves as part of the casting team from America's Got Talent. For a moment, she didn't understand. The words felt distant, like they were meant for someone standing behind her. She stared at the passing crowd, frozen in place, while the voice continued speaking. Then the meaning finally sank in. They had listened to her demo. They loved it. The producers wanted her to come in for an official audition. Her breath caught. Her vision blurred. The spoon fell from her hand, clattering onto the bench. She pressed her palm over her mouth, eyes widening as the reality washed through her. The baby shifted in her lap, sensing her sudden stillness. The voice on the other end repeated the details gently, letting her know she would receive an email with the time, date, and address. Tears spilled before she could stop them. She choked out a thank you, her voice cracking in a way she couldn't hide. When the call ended, she held her baby tightly against her chest, burying her face in his small shoulder as she cried openly. They were not the tears she cried at night. These were light, trembling, disbelieving, the kind of tears she hadn't felt in years. She didn't see Keanu approaching the platform until his shadow stretched across her feet. He had come with lunch bags, neatly packed warm food inside, and a soft toy tucked under his arm for the baby. When he noticed her shoulders shaking, he dropped to a knee, immediately setting the bags aside as he asked if she was hurt. She lifted her head, slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks, and tried to speak. The words tangled in her throat before she finally managed to explain. She told him America's Got Talent had called. They wanted her. They wanted her voice, her recording, her story. The moment the words left her lips, her breath trembled again, as though saying them made the miracle feel more real. Keanu's face lit up with a genuine happiness, so bright it softened every line around his eyes. He let out a small breath of relief, as if he had been carrying hope for her on his shoulders all along. Keanu's smile widened as she repeated the news, this time with a breathless laugh cutting through her tears. He sat beside her on the bench, not caring about the people walking past or the curious glances from commuters. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her he knew they would hear what he heard. He said her voice carried something real, something impossible to ignore, and the world was finally waking up to it. She tried to respond, but her emotions tangled again, spilling into another wave of tears. She kept shaking her head, overwhelmed, repeating that she couldn't believe this was happening. She said it didn't feel possible for someone like her. She looked down at her clothes, worn, faded, old, and whispered that she didn't have anything decent to wear to an audition. The shame in her voice made her bow her head, as if afraid the dream would disappear if she admitted her fears out loud. Keanu didn't let her sink into that doubt. He reassured her firmly that clothes were the last thing she needed to worry about. He told her he would help her prepare, not in a way that made her feel indebted, but in a way that allowed her to stand confidently in front of the judges. He promised to keep everything simple and respectful, making sure every step honored her dignity. She looked at him with wide, trembling eyes, startled by how effortlessly he removed the weight she had been carrying. Her baby reached for Keanu's hand, and he smiled as he gently touched the child's tiny fingers. He told her that she had already accomplished the hardest part. She had believed in herself long enough to allow her voice to be heard. She had stood in front of a microphone when fear begged her to run. She had allowed hope back into her life. The rest, he said, would unfold one step at a time. She held the phone in her hand, staring at the missed call notification, as if it were a doorway she'd waited her whole life to see. The platform around them blurred into gentle motion, but she felt anchored for the first time in years. She looked at Keanu with gratitude that tightened her throat, unable to form the words she wanted to say. He didn't need her to speak. He could see the truth in her eyes. Something had shifted forever. The world had finally answered her voice, and the audition that could change everything was now waiting for her. The morning of the audition arrived with a quiet heaviness in the air, as if the city itself sensed how much was at stake. She barely slept the night before waking again and again to check the time, terrified she might oversleep and lose her chance. Her baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her tension, and she rocked him gently until dawn filtered through the thin shelter curtains. Keanu arrived early carrying a small breakfast bag and a soft blanket for the baby. He kept his presence calm, grounded, almost invisible, not wanting to add to her nerves. She wore the simple thrift store dress he had helped her pick out the day before, something modest but clean, a dress that fit her gently despite its age. She kept smoothing the fabric with uncertain hands, unsure if she looked out of place or simply hopeful. Keanu told her she looked perfect, and although she didn't fully believe it, his reassurance eased the tight band of fear around her chest. The America's Got Talent venue buzzed with activity. Contestants filled every corner of the lobby, some with glittering outfits, others with guitars, violins, or full dance teams behind them. Makeup artists fixed last-minute shine. Parents rehearsed lines with their children. Camera crews floated through the room, capturing nerves and excitement alike. She stepped inside, holding her baby close, her heart pounding at the sight of all the confidence around her. She felt small, unsure, painfully aware of the thin straps of her dress and the thrift store shoes that pinched her toes. Keanu walked beside her, but stayed slightly behind, allowing her space to move as the performer she was about to become. He dressed simply in jeans and a plain jacket, blending into the background unnoticed by the passing crowd. The anonymity was intentional. Today wasn't about him. Today belonged entirely to her. When they reached the contestant waiting area, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Dozens of performers looked poised and polished, sitting upright with perfect posture, surrounded by supportive friends or professional managers. She looked down at her baby, his soft hair, his tiny hands clutching her dress, and wondered whether she had made a mistake. She whispered that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't like them. Her voice shook with fear. Keanu placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He leaned in, speaking softly enough that only she could hear him. He reminded her that every person in the room had once been terrified. Every performer started somewhere unknown. Every voice had its first moment on stage. He told her she wasn't competing with them. She was simply telling her truth. And nothing was more powerful than truth. As her name was called over the speaker, she felt her entire body tense. She adjusted her baby's blanket and handed him carefully to a staff volunteer who had agreed to sit with him during her audition. She hesitated, glancing back as though afraid to let go, but Keanu nodded gently, encouraging her forward. She took a shaky breath, stepped toward the hallway leading to the stage, and felt the world narrow to a single path she had avoided her entire life. The stage lights glowed through the doorway. The distant murmur of the audience rumbled like a wave. Her palms were damp, her heartbeat loud enough to hear in her ears. She whispered a small promise to her baby to be brave, even just for a few minutes. Then she stepped onto the stage. The judges looked up immediately, their faces warm with curiosity. She stood in the center, trembling slightly, fingers twisting at the hem of her dress. The silence pressed on her thick and unforgiving. But she lifted her chin and met the judge's eyes. One of the judges leaned forward and greeted her with warmth, asking her to introduce herself. Her voice trembled as she spoke her name. The next question came gently, asking what brought her here today. She hesitated, swallowing the tightness in her throat before answering. She told them that music had once been her whole world, the last piece of her identity when everything else fell apart. She admitted she had lost her husband in a construction accident, that the grief had pushed her into a spiral she wasn't prepared for, and that she had ended up with nothing but a stroller, a blanket, and a voice she wasn't sure mattered anymore. The room grew still. Even the soft rustle of the audience faded into silence. Her honesty carried a weight that seemed to pull every gaze toward her. Another judge asked where she sang now, and she whispered that she sang underground in subway tunnels because people rarely judged what they didn't stop to see. She said singing kept her alive when life felt too heavy to carry. The confession cracked something inside her, but she stood firmly, refusing to let her knees buckle. A judge asked who supported her through everything. She inhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in her chest. She said she didn't have anyone. Not family, not friends. Only one person had stepped into her life when she least expected it. A kind stranger who believed in her voice long before she dared to. The audience leaned in, sensing a story beneath her words. A judge asked softly who that stranger was. She hesitated. Keanu, standing hidden behind a backstage curtain, lowered his head slightly, hoping she would protect her own spotlight. But she lifted her eyes and spoke with a quiet strength that carried across the entire auditorium. She said he didn't want credit or recognition. He didn't want attention, but he deserved to be acknowledged. She said it was Keanu Reeves. The room erupted in shock. Gasps spread across the seats, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Several audience members stood scanning the backstage area as though he might appear. The judges exchanged wide-eyed looks, stunned by the reveal. She held her ground, her hands trembling, but her voice steady as she explained that he had given her hope when she had none left. In that moment, she no longer felt small. She felt seen. And as the judges prepared to hear her sing, the entire room leaned forward, ready to witness the woman Keanu Reeves believed in. The moment her voice carried Keanu's name across the stage, the entire room reacted as if struck by a sudden current. A wave of gasps swept through the audience, followed by startled murmurs that rippled from row to row. Several people stood instantly, craning their necks toward the backstage curtains in hopes of spotting him. The judges exchanged stunned looks, eyebrows raised, mouths slightly open, trying to process what they had just heard. One judge leaned forward in disbelief and asked her quietly if she truly meant Keanu Reeves. She nodded, clutching the microphone with trembling fingers. She didn't embellish or dramatize the moment. She simply confirmed the truth. She said he had helped her when she had no one. She said he had heard her singing in a subway station and had believed in something she could no longer see in herself. The audience grew silent again, taking in her words as though they were hearing the opening lines of a story they would never forget. Backstage, Keanu's heart raced. He had hoped she wouldn't mention him, not for his sake, but because he wanted every spotlight to shine on her alone. He stood near the dimly lit side wall, his hands pressed together as he waited. When he heard his name echo from the stage, he shut his eyes briefly, steadying himself. He felt exposed for a moment, uneasy at being drawn into the center of attention. But as he listened to her steady voice, the unease melted into something deeper. Pride. Not the kind that swelled loudly, but the quiet kind that tightened his throat and warmed the edges of his eyes. A judge addressed the audience softly, acknowledging the shock of the moment. Another turned to her and asked if he was truly present in the building. She hesitated, glancing toward backstage with a hopeful flicker in her eyes. The audience followed her gaze like a single living body, whispers filling the air. But Keanu stayed hidden. He wasn't afraid. He simply didn't want to disrupt her moment. He wanted her triumph to be hers alone, not overshadowed by his appearance. He knew stepping out would turn the audition into something else entirely, and today belonged to her. The judges, realizing he wasn't going to appear, refocused on her with renewed respect. One of them encouraged her, gently telling her the most important thing now was her voice. Another asked what she planned to sing. She answered softly, her voice trembling, but resolute. She chose the same song she had sung underground, the same one Keanu had first heard, drifting beneath the station noise. The choice carried weight. It was the song that had held her together through the darkest moments, and now it would be the song to introduce her to the world. She stepped slightly closer to the microphone. Her breath shook as she inhaled. Her fingers pressed tightly against her dress to steady herself. Then the music began. The opening chords floated into the air, gentle, at first settling over the room like a soft hush before a storm. The audience leaned in. The judges straightened in their seats. Keanu, still hidden backstage, felt his heartbeat sink with the rhythm. He brought a hand to his mouth, bracing himself for the moment he knew would break him open all over again. She closed her eyes, and she began to sing. The first note left her lips so softly that the room leaned forward as one. Her voice trembled for a split second, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. But then something shifted. The fear she carried began to loosen its grip. Her tone strengthened, blooming through the auditorium with the same raw honesty that had stopped Keanu in his steps weeks earlier. The judges' expressions changed almost immediately. Their curiosity melted into astonishment. A few seconds into the chorus, one of the judges lifted a hand to her mouth, eyes filling with emotion. Another judge closed his eyes entirely, as if the purity of her tone demanded silence from every part of him. Even the restless stirrings of the audience faded with each rising note. It felt as though the entire building was holding its breath. Backstage, Keanu pressed his palm against the side wall to steady himself. Hearing her sing here on a real stage in front of thousands, with light pouring over her instead of shadows, was almost too much. She wasn't the woman he first saw curled over a stroller beneath flickering subway lights. She was standing tall now, surrounded by warmth she had earned with every scar she carried. By the time she reached the bridge, something extraordinary happened. The audience rose to their feet, not in a sudden burst, but gradually, as though lifted by the power of the story unfolding before them. People placed hands over their hearts. Some wiped tears from their cheeks. A murmur of awe swept softly through the room as she poured years of pain, hope, and quiet endurance into the final verse. She ended the song with a long, trembling note that floated through the silence like a prayer. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world stood still with her. Then the applause erupted in a wave so thunderous, she flinched, overwhelmed by the intensity of it. She tried to smile, but her lips quivered. Tears streamed down her face, illuminated in the stage lights, as if the world were finally seeing her clearly. One judge leaned close to the microphone and told her she was the reason they did the show. Another praised her authenticity, saying her voice carried the kind of honesty that couldn't be taught. A third judge told her she had something rare, something people didn't forget after hearing it once. Their words washed over her like warm rain after a long drought. As she walked off stage, her legs shook uncontrollably. The moment she cleared the curtain, Keanu stepped forward and caught her in a tight embrace. She pressed her face against his chest, sobbing with relief, disbelief, and joy. He held her the way someone holds a person reborn, whispering that she had earned every second of applause. She didn't feel like a forgotten woman anymore. She felt seen, heard, lifted, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. The world reacted faster than she could understand. Within hours of her audition, airing, her phone, once silent for days at a time, began buzzing non-stop with notifications she didn't know how to process. A staff member from the show had helped her set up a simple social media account so the producers could tag her, and by that evening, her follower count rose from 0 to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Her audition clip circulated across platforms, gathering comments from people all over the country who said her story felt like a reminder of something the world had forgotten. Resilience, grace, and the way a single act of kindness could change a life. The clip of her subway performance, recorded by random commuters who had once ignored her, resurfaced as well. People stitched it next to her audition video, comparing the echoing tunnel notes to the soaring clarity of her stage voice. Strangers wrote things like, "This gave me chills," and "How did we walk past her?" and not know, and the angel under the station. The nickname spread quickly. It trended on multiple platforms as thousands of people shared the story of the woman with the forgotten voice who rose out of the shadows. Reaction videos from vocal coaches, music teachers, and audition experts appeared within hours. Many cried as they watched her sing. Some whispered that talent like hers appeared once in a generation. Others focused on the purity of her tone, saying she sang the way people feel when they're trying to find hope. The comments flooded in faster than she could read them. Messages from strangers told her she was brave, that she inspired them, that her voice reminded them they weren't alone in their struggles. She pressed her hand over her trembling chest every time she tried to read more, overwhelmed by the wave of kindness. Offers for temporary housing and safe shelter began arriving as well. A few organizations reached out to the show, directly offering support for her and her baby. Some offered hotel rooms, others small rental units, and several charity groups volunteered to cover her baby's formula. Diapers, clothes, and medical checkups for as long as she needed. It felt unreal. For months, she had struggled to afford the smallest necessities, and now people she had never met were trying to help her rebuild her life. Meanwhile, Keanu remained completely silent publicly. Journalists and entertainment reporters began calling his representatives, trying to confirm whether he had discovered her underground and brought her to the show. They wanted interviews, statements, photos, anything that could turn the viral moment into the next celebrity trend. But Keanu turned every request down. He refused interviews, declined appearances, and avoided all publicity connected to her story. He didn't want the focus to shift. He didn't want her voice overshadowed by his name. He had promised her that she wouldn't owe him anything, and he intended to keep that promise. The producers of the show arranged vocal coaching for her as she prepared for the next round. When she walked into the rehearsal room, for the first time she felt as though she had stepped into another world. A professional vocal coach greeted her warmly, praising her natural talent and telling her they were honored to help her grow. She listened carefully to every instruction, eager to learn, soaking up guidance, like someone who had been starving for direction for far too long. Each rehearsal built her confidence little by little. She practiced breathing exercises, learned how to protect her voice, and worked on shaping her tone with intention rather than survival. For the first time since losing her husband, she felt something in her life rise instead of collapse. Every day brought something new she never imagined for herself. Interview requests filled her inbox, though the show's staff shielded her from anything overwhelming. Fans sent messages telling her they played her audition every morning to feel stronger. Some wrote that her voice helped them through grief. Others said her courage made them believe they could begin again. Each message touched a place inside her she thought had gone numb long ago. The support extended to her baby as well. Boxes of donated supplies arrived through the show's reception desk, diapers, formula, blankets, and toys she never could have afforded. One charity group even offered vouchers for medical visits and checkups to ensure her child stayed healthy. As she sorted through the supplies in the small temporary room, the show provided tears welled in her eyes. She had never asked anyone for more than a moment of compassion, yet people from across the nation were giving her more than she knew how to receive. Still, through all the sudden attention and the rising excitement, she remained grounded in the quiet truth that this journey started in a subway station with a stranger who believed in her before millions ever heard her sing. Keanu checked in silently, sending short messages asking how rehearsals were going, if she was eating enough, if she needed anything for the baby. He never asked about the online praise or the interviews. He didn't want credit. He wanted her to stand on her own, supported by her strength rather than his name. In the rehearsal studio, her coach often paused during sessions just to praise her growth. They told her she had a gift not only because of her voice, but because of the way she could make people feel her truth in each word she sang. She practiced until her throat ached, determined not to waste a single opportunity that had been placed before her. Nights were the hardest. Exhaustion crept in, and memories of her old life resurfaced like shadows that refused to loosen their hold. But when she looked at her baby sleeping in the crib provided by the show, she felt something fierce rise inside her. A promise she had made silently the moment the audition call came in. She would not return to the darkness she had climbed out of. Her life was changing, slowly, quietly, powerfully. And for the first time in years, she could finally see a future she wanted to walk toward. Advancing to the next round felt unreal to her. When the producers announced her name among the contestants moving forward, she stood still for several seconds, unsure she had heard correctly. Other performers celebrated loudly around her, hugging their families or lifting their children into the air. She simply covered her mouth with her hands, breath, shaking eyes filling with tears. She tried to blink away. She wasn't used to good news. She wasn't used to doors opening instead of closing. For her, each step forward felt like walking across unfamiliar ground, fragile but full of possibility. The show's producers quickly arranged to film parts of her background story. They wanted America to understand where she came from, what she had endured, and what her voice meant to her. She was nervous about letting cameras into her past, but the staff treated her story with care. They interviewed her softly, never pushing, never exploiting her pain. They asked her to show them the subway station where she used to sing. She agreed, though her stomach twisted as she imagined returning with lights and crew members. When they arrived at the station, she stood in her old corner and watched the crew set up equipment. For a moment, she felt exposed, as though the memories lingering in the concrete walls were pushing against her chest. She whispered that this place had broken her and saved her at the same time. One of the producers nodded quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. When they asked her to sing a few lines for the camera, her throat tightened. She looked over at Keanu, who had come to support her, though he stayed out of the shot. He leaned against a support pillar in the distance, hands in his pockets, offering a small, encouraging nod. She swallowed, her nerves lifted her chin, and sang a verse. The acoustics of the tunnel carried her voice just as they had before, but this time she wasn't alone. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't singing for spare coins. She was singing for millions who had already heard her heart on stage. The producers also filmed a segment of her walking outside the venue at night. She cradled her baby in her arms while talking about the fear of losing her husband, the spiral that followed, and the way she clung to music to stay alive. Keanu walked with her during the shoot, close enough to support her, but far enough to stay out of the camera frame. When the crew asked if he wanted to step into the shot, he politely declined. He didn't want the focus shifted. This was her story. As the rounds continued, the pressure grew. Contestants who once felt like strangers began to feel like competitors. She could sense their nerves, their hopes, and their silent comparisons. Many had vocal coaches, stylists, and support teams who reminded them to hydrate, rehearse, breathe, and smile. She had only herself, except she wasn't truly alone. Keanu checked on her every day, asking how her voice felt, whether she had eaten, whether the baby had everything he needed. He didn't hover. He simply supported her in the quiet ways she had come to trust. But the pressure still found its way under her skin. She battled nerves before every performance, sitting backstage with her hands trembling, afraid that one shaky note could send her back to the life she had fought so hard to escape. The fear of failing felt heavier than any microphone she had ever held. Each round forced her to stretch further emotionally and technically. She chose songs that reflected chapters of her life, pieces that carried the weight of grief, love, and survival. During rehearsals, vocal coaches praised her intuition. They told her she didn't just sing notes, she sang memories. She sang pain softened by hope. She sang like someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still show up. One coach told her that audiences could sense when someone had lived the words they were singing. She didn't argue. She simply nodded because she knew every lyric came from a place that once felt too dark to escape. Now those same memories were becoming her strength. But even with the encouragement, she battled exhaustion. Caring for her baby between rehearsals left her drained. She often stayed up late practicing softly so she wouldn't wake him. Some mornings her voice felt fragile and fear grabbed her chest before she took her first breath to warm up. She worried the judges would see the fatigue in her eyes. She worried the audience would sense the pressure pushing against her ribs. Keanu noticed. Whenever her shoulders slumped or her voice faded mid-sentence, he stepped in quietly. He picked up groceries without being asked. He drove her to and from rehearsals when she was too tired to navigate public transportation. When she ran out of diapers, they appeared in her bag with no explanation. When the baby's stroller broke, a new one arrived the next morning. He never made his help feel like charity. He made it feel like partnership. As she advanced into the quarterfinals, the show filmed her reactions after each performance. She watched her own clips online late at night and was startled by the person she saw on screen. The woman standing on stage looked poised, expressive, and strong. She didn't look like someone who had once slept in shelters or counted change to buy formula. She looked like someone rising. Judges began calling her one of the most emotionally compelling performers of the season. Audience votes poured in from across the country. People sent messages saying her courage reminded them to keep fighting through their own storms. She read those messages with her baby asleep on her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was becoming someone she could be proud of. And somewhere along the journey, something inside her shifted quietly but unmistakably. She began to believe she deserved to stand on that stage. The night before the semifinals, the city felt different to her. Even the usual noise seemed quieter, as if Los Angeles itself was holding its breath. She finished feeding her baby, tucked him gently into the small crib provided by the temporary housing sponsor, and sat in silence for a long time. Her heart beat unevenly. Her hands wouldn't stay still. Excitement and fear twisted together until she couldn't tell one from the other. It would have been easy to stay inside and distract herself, but something pulled her toward the place where everything began. She wrapped her baby in a soft blanket, secured him in the stroller, and stepped into the cool night air. The city lights flickered across puddles on the sidewalk. The subway entrance loomed ahead like an old memory waiting to be acknowledged. She hesitated only once before descending the steps into the underground. The station was nearly empty at this hour. A few workers swept litter into bins. A man slept on a bench with a jacket draped over him. The hum of distant trains echoed faintly in the distance. She walked toward the far corner, the same corner where she once sat on a piece of cardboard, the same place where she sang with a trembling voice and a heart full of fear, hoping for enough coins to buy formula. She stood still, letting the memories wash over her. She could almost see her old self there, tired, hungry, grieving, and afraid of tomorrow. That version of her felt like a stranger and a sister all at once. She whispered a quiet thank you into the dim air. Thank you for giving me a place to sing when I had nowhere else. Thank you for being the only space that didn't ask me to pretend. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly, letting the moment settle. She didn't expect anyone to be watching. She didn't expect footprints to echo behind her. But when she turned, Keanu was there, hands in the pockets of his worn jacket, watching her with a soft expression that carried understanding instead of surprise. "I thought I'd find you here," he said gently. She couldn't speak for a moment. Her throat tightened. She looked back at the empty corner, then at him, then at the stroller. "I don't know why I came," she admitted. "Maybe I needed to see it one more time. Maybe I needed to remember where I started so I don't lose myself tomorrow." Keanu nodded slowly. "You're not losing anything," he said. "You're reclaiming what life tried to take from you." She bit her lip, fighting the sting in her eyes. What if it all disappears? What if tomorrow I fail and everything goes back to the way it was? Keanu stepped closer, but not too close. He let her have space, as he always did. "You're not going back," he told her. "You're not the woman who stood here months ago. You've grown beyond this place. You've learned how strong you are." A trembling breath escaped her. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of course you are," Keanu answered. "Fear means you're standing somewhere new." Her shoulders shook as a quiet sob slipped out. For the first time in days, she let herself cry. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying because she had finally reached a point where hope felt possible and possibility was terrifying. Keanu waited. He didn't rush her. He didn't tell her to stop. He just stood beside her, steady and calm, the kind of presence that made the world feel grounded again. "Tomorrow doesn't define your worth," he said. "You've already proven more than any stage can measure." She wiped her face and exhaled. For the first time that night, she believed him. She pushed the stroller gently back and forth, as if the motion steadied her thoughts. The station lights flickered above them, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. It felt surreal to stand in the same place where she once counted loose coins, with trembling fingers, terrified she wouldn't have enough to feed her child. Now she was preparing for a semifinals performance watched by millions. The contrast overwhelmed her. "I used to think this corner was the only place I belonged," she said quietly, like the world had already decided who I was allowed to be. Keanu shook his head. "This place never defined you. It was only a chapter, not the whole story." She looked around the station again. "I kept expecting someone to save me back then, someone to pull me out, but no one came." "You saved yourself," Keanu replied. "I just happened to hear you at the right moment." His words settled into her chest with a weight that felt strangely comforting. She had spent so long believing she existed only in the shadows that stepping into the light now felt almost unnatural. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces of her life together. "What if tomorrow I freeze?" she asked. "What if they see right through me? What if I'm just pretending to be someone stronger than I really am?" Keanu took one step closer, enough for his presence to warm the cold air between them. "Strength isn't pretending," he said. "Strength is surviving long enough for your voice to be heard, and you did that. Everything after this is growth." She looked down at her baby sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm that lived inside his mother's heart. "I want him to be proud of me," she said softly. "I want him to see that I tried." "He already will," Keanu answered. "He'll grow up knowing his mother didn't quit even when quitting felt easier." A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she let it fall, letting it honor the years of hardship she had endured. Keanu's voice lowered, steady and sincere. "You didn't get here because of me," he said. "You got here because you survived, because no matter how many times life pushed you down, you stood back up." She breathed in slow and deep. The fear didn't vanish, but something inside her shifted. A new strength formed in the space where doubt once lived. Standing in the dim corner of a forgotten station, she realized she wasn't returning to her past. She was saying goodbye to it. The night of the finals arrived with an energy that vibrated through the entire venue. Cars lined the streets, camera crews hurried through back corridors, and contestants paced nervously behind stage doors. But she stood completely still, holding her baby close, before handing him to the childcare volunteer who had become like family during the competition. Her hands trembled, her breath shook. But there was a strange peace under all of it, a calm that came from knowing this moment wasn't a desperate grasp for survival anymore. It was a declaration, a final page in a chapter she never thought she would escape. Backstage, the other contestants wore sequined outfits, dramatic makeup, and bold expressions sharpened by weeks of intense training. She wore a soft, cream-colored dress from a thrift store. Her hair was gently curled by one of the stylists who had grown attached to her story. There was nothing extravagant about her appearance. And yet she carried an unmistakable gravity, a sincerity that couldn't be taught or polished. Even the producers felt it. Whenever she walked by, conversations quieted. People instinctively stepped aside, sensing the emotional weight she carried into this performance. She rehearsed her chosen song in her mind, letting the melody settle into her bones. It wasn't meant to be flashy. It didn't have big notes designed to manipulate applause. Instead, it was an acoustic piece stripped of everything except truth. A single guitar, a single voice. It was the same kind of song she used to whisper to her son late at night when she thought he deserved a better life than the one she could give. It was the same song she once sang quietly under the subway station when she needed to feel human again. The producers approached her, gently asking if she was ready. She nodded, though she wasn't sure anyone was ever truly ready for a moment like this. As she followed them toward the stage entrance, she glanced back at the small screen showing the audience. The judges sat tall, prepared to witness something big. The crowd was electric, thousands of faces illuminated by stage lights. Somewhere in that sea of people sat Keanu, though she couldn't see him. He had messaged earlier, promising he would be somewhere in the building, but insisting she take this moment alone, that it belonged to her. Not to him, not to her past, not to her pain, just her voice. She stepped into the wings, waiting for the final cue. Her heart pounded so loudly, she wondered if the microphone would pick it up. She thought of her husband, their small apartment, his laughter, the future they planned before everything collapsed. She thought of the nights she cried into her son's blanket, terrified she was failing him. She thought of the subway corner that had become both her cage and her refuge. Then she thought of Keanu, the moment he crouched down so she wouldn't feel small, the moment he told her she had something rare. Those words echoed through her as she stepped onto the stage. When the spotlight hit her, she blinked but didn't falter. She took one breath, slow, steady, brave. This was her moment. The first strum of the acoustic guitar echoed through the auditorium, soft and fragile, like a heartbeat in an empty room. She closed her eyes, letting the sound settle around her before opening her mouth to release the first note. It was gentle, trembling, almost whispered. But the vulnerability in it moved through the room like a ripple drawing every ear toward her. The crowd, once buzzing with excitement, fell silent in seconds. Her voice carried warmth, sorrow, and something else, rebirth. It wasn't the polished voice of a trained superstar. It wasn't the fiery belt of a showstopper. It was honest. It was broken. It was human. And the more she sang, the stronger it grew. Every lyric felt like a confession. Every breath felt like a chance she thought she would never get. Up in the shadows of the very back row, Keanu watched with his hat low and mask covering half his face. Even so, his eyes glistened. Not because she was singing well, he knew she would, but because she was finally singing from a place beyond survival. She was singing from a place of ownership, of dignity reclaimed. He had seen her voice bloom from an underground whisper to a force powerful enough to command a national audience. As the chorus approached, the cameras tightened on her trembling hands. Viewers across the nation saw the slight shake of someone who had endured too much, lost too much, and still stood there anyway. A judge wiped away tears openly. Another clasped both hands under her chin as if afraid to breathe and interrupt the moment. In the third row, a father pulled his daughter closer, whispering something about hope and strength. Her voice lifted into the emotional peak, not loud, but controlled, pure, and filled with the weight of every night she had spent alone in the cold. It wasn't practiced perfection. It was the sound of a mother fighting for her child, of a woman refusing to disappear beneath the world's indifference. Halfway through the song, the audience began standing row by row, quietly at first, then all at once. By the time she reached the bridge, the room was flooded with people rising to their feet. Keanu lowered his head, not wanting attention, but he couldn't stop the pride swelling in his chest. Then came the last note. It hovered in the air like a prayer, fragile and sacred, fading slowly into a silence so profound that even the cameras seemed to pause in reverence. When the host finally spoke, it was with a tremble in his voice. Before the judges offered their comments, one producer stepped on stage with a microphone announcing that a special supporter was in the audience. The crowd erupted, scanning the room, shouting Keanu's name. Some pointed at random men in hats. A teenager screamed each time she thought she spotted him. But Keanu remained tucked behind a pillar, calm and invisible, just as he preferred. Back on stage, she laughed softly through tears, knowing exactly where he was, even if no one else did. She pressed her hand to her heart as the applause continued, a wave that refused to settle. She didn't win first place that night, but as she stepped off the stage, knowing millions had seen her, heard her, and felt her story, she realized something far more powerful. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting to be seen. she already was. When the lights from the studio finally dimmed and the crowds dissolved into the night, Keanu slipped quietly through a side exit, avoiding the flashes of cameras and the reporters, hoping to catch one last interview. The cool air outside felt calm against his skin, a gentle contrast to the emotion-filled chaos he had just witnessed inside. He adjusted his jacket, took a slow breath, and began walking down the nearly empty sidewalk with his hands tucked into his pockets. The night around him hummed with the soft sounds of traffic and distant city lights, but his thoughts were somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter. He replayed the journey in his mind, starting with the moment the subway train stalled weeks ago. He had been annoyed at first, late for a charity event he didn't want to disappoint, but then he remembered how the groans of frustrated commuters faded the moment he heard her voice. That haunting melody rising through the concrete tunnels, that impossible depth coming from someone the world had overlooked for too long. He remembered standing there, frozen, feeling something inside him shift in a way he couldn't explain at the time. If the train hadn't stalled, he would have walked past her without ever hearing a single note. If the conductor hadn't announced a 20-minute delay, he might never have noticed the stroller, the thin blanket, the cardboard beneath her. It struck him how fragile life's turning points could be, and how often extraordinary moments hid inside ordinary inconveniences. A simple delay had redirected two lives, a mother fighting to hold on, and a baby who deserved more than the world had given him. As he walked beneath a row of flickering streetlights, Keanu thought about the first conversation they shared. Her voice trembling as she told him about losing her husband, the way she apologized between sentences as if her grief inconvenienced him. He remembered her disbelief when he asked whether she still wanted to pursue music. He remembered the hope in her eyes, the fear behind it, and the way she tried to push away the possibility of a dream she thought she no longer deserved. He also remembered the small studio session, the way her voice filled the room so completely that even the sound engineer forgot to breathe. He remembered how she covered her mouth in shock when she heard the demo playback, as if recognizing a part of herself she hadn't seen in years. That was the moment he knew she was meant for more. Not because he pitied her, but because talent like that carried a responsibility. It needed to be shared. It needed to be heard. Keanu paused at a crosswalk, watching a few cars roll past as his breath rose in faint clouds. He thought about the weeks that followed, the nights he visited the station with food blankets and toys, the mornings she doubted herself, the afternoons she pushed through exhaustion because her son needed a future brighter than a subway platform. He admired her resilience more than she would ever know. And tonight, after seeing her final performance, after hearing that last trembling note echo through the auditorium like a prayer, he realized something powerful. Her life hadn't changed because someone famous stepped in. Her life changed because she refused to give up long enough for someone to hear her. He continued walking into the quiet Los Angeles night, aware that a new chapter had begun, not just for her, but for the child she carried, and for the countless unseen people whose gifts remained buried under hardship. As he reached the end of the block, Keanu stopped beneath a street lamp and looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint behind the city haze, but they were still there. It reminded him of her voice, even when life dimmed it, even when the world overlooked it. It never stopped shining. It only needed someone to notice. He thought about her future now, no longer sleeping in a station corner, no longer rationing formula to stretch another day. She had secured a small but promising record deal offered by a producer who watched her audition clip online. The deal wasn't flashy, but it was stable. It came with a modest apartment, childcare assistance, and a team who believed in her potential. For the first time since losing her husband, she told Keanu she felt like she was finally breathing again. He didn't join her celebration dinner with the show's staff. He didn't appear in interviews. He didn't accept the dozen talk show invitations that begged him to share his side of the miracle. Instead, he politely declined them all. He didn't want to distract from her story or turn it into a spectacle. He knew that true kindness didn't ask for applause. It simply planted a seed and stepped back so the garden could grow. As he continued walking, he thought again about how close they had come to never crossing paths. One small delay, one faint melody, one moment when he could have kept walking like everyone else, but chose to stop instead. That choice had changed everything. Not because he was a hero, but because he allowed himself to listen, really listen to someone the world ignored. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air settle into his chest. A quiet realization rose inside him, gentle yet profound. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin in the most ordinary places. It was a truth he had seen play out again and again in his life, but never as clearly as now. As he turned the corner toward the dimly lit parking lot, he imagined people watching this story unfold on their screens. People who might walk past someone tomorrow without noticing them. People who might forget how powerful a single moment of compassion could be. He hoped this story reminded them. And so, he leaves viewers with two questions, simple but deeply human. Have you ever seen someone's life change because one person noticed their worth? And what story would you like to see Keanu Reeves in next?